Hey, welcome back. Hope your week is going well for you and that you are pursuing peace in your life and the relationships around you, that you're praying for peace in the very same kinds of ways. So let me remind you real quickly, we started on Monday with this topic of being a peacemaker. And we noted the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount there in Matthew 5:9, where he declared, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons or the children of God." We talked about the fact that peace doesn't happen automatically. You have to work at it. You have to pursue it. You have to strive for it. It's not something that we learn about. It's something that we live out in our life to be peacemakers. And so when I ended on Monday, I had mentioned to us that we were going to spend our time today on the subject of anger. Now, I don't think I have to introduce that. I don't think I have to define that to anybody. I don't have to give you an illustration about what anger is because we've experienced that. We're all familiar with anger, and in fact, we have all been practitioners of anger. Much could be said about it, but for today, for the purpose of our time this week, I want to remind us about what God's Word says about the danger of anger, and then provide some comments about how we can deal with the anger. So let's begin for the moment with the realities of this world in which we live. And it is the fact, one of the realities is that our world is filled with people who are angry. Angry. Some days appear worse than others. The things we hear and see, and the newscasts and the conversations are evidence of this anger. Another reality that we live with is that every one of us is angry at some point in time and multiple times, from time to time. Third reality is we can learn to manage the anger of our life. We can control it. And then a fourth reality is that managing anger is really hard to do. So we've got to prepare now before we get angry. Prepare now so that when the angry people or the circumstances that would make us angry come and we encounter those, that we'll be ready for those challenges that we'll face. Anger is an emotion. And we need to control it rather than just allowing it to control us. We must recognize it is powerful. Proverbs 25, verse 28 says this: "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." Self-control is critically important, not just for anger, but that is our focus for today. You see, without self-control, our lives are left vulnerable to the attacks of whatever crippling emotions that we may experience. Anger is powerful, right? It is an emotional warning light that alerts us to the fact that something is not right. Now, please note that anger in itself is not sin. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, we're told, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." And so you see, the challenge for each one of us is to learn how to express anger appropriately. Unfortunately, most of us have not had good models showing us how to do this. I thought back over the years of my ministry and the opportunities to speak with individuals and with couples, and oftentimes the issue of anger would come up, and we would have some conversation about, well, what was the home like where you were raised, and how did your parents deal with anger? And more often than not, it's not a pretty picture. The vast majority of people have not had good examples about how to control and to manage the anger in their lives. On the other hand, we look all around us and we see the remnants of that kind of situation. The mismanagement of anger is seen in the emotional destruction in people's lives, the uncertainty, the unsteadiness, and the broken relationships, husbands and wives and families and friends, broken because of anger. Proverbs 27 verse 4 says this, "Wrath is cruel and anger is overwhelming." It is powerful. Colossians chapter 3 verse 8, it describes a progression of sin that begins with anger. And I quote, "But now you yourselves are to put off all of these: anger, wrath, malice, slander, filthy language out of your mouth." Progression begins with anger and is accompanied by all kinds of unfruitful behaviors. So the inherent dangers of anger are obvious, and we're all familiar with the results of anger. And if we are going to be peacemakers as God has called us to be, we must deal with anger in healthy, constructive ways. So let me share some thoughts with you today. One of the things we need to do is to admit that we are angry. To admit that we're angry. Now, the biblical examples are many. But my mind this week, as I was preparing, my mind went to Nehemiah, the Old Testament prophet Nehemiah, and he went to Jerusalem, went back to Jerusalem to help to rebuild the walls there. And he discovered, arriving there, he was hearing the testimony and the complaints of the people who were there, that the leaders had been charging their fellow Jews interest. And this practice had led them to become discouraged and financially strapped and very frustrated. And so in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 6, Nehemiah simply says, having heard all of that, become aware of the situation, he said, "And I became very angry." See, there's something about us that we understand it within us that anger's not necessarily a good thing, and it's certainly not when it's just turned loose and there's no control to it. And so oftentimes we find it hard to say that we're angry. We blame a circumstance, or we blame an individual, and they caused me to respond like this. But we have to be honest enough with ourselves to say that I'm angry. That this encounter or this circumstance or this word that you have said to me has made me angry. We have to be honest enough to admit that anger has risen up within our hearts. Because you see, when you deny your anger, it's not going to cause it to disappear. Even though it may not be visibly obvious at the moment, anger that gets covered up will show itself in a variety of ways. Sarcasm, gossip, complaining, criticism, aggressive attitudes. And as it continues to simmer, anger will produce irrational behavior and destructive actions. When we admit that we are angry, we initiate the healing process. We now know that there's a matter that needs our attention. We don't shove it down. We're honest about it. Now, please hear me. To admit our anger does not mean that we are to express our anger. It's not like, well, I'll just show you how angry I am. That's not what we're talking about. You might chuckle about that, or that might even bring memories, painful memories to you. And I remember years ago, an individual who tried to excuse his anger, his very verbal anger that sometimes came to me, but it was not exclusive to me. And his excuse was, well, it's better for me just to get it out. Well, that really what he should have understood it was better for him to manage it and to control it, and not just to spew it to everybody. And he may have felt better having said some very hard and hurtful things. He would have felt better, but there was a trail of destruction that followed his angry words. So it doesn't mean we're to express our anger. Verbal and or physical outbursts are not remedy to anger. And oftentimes we need a second way to deal with our anger, and it is this. We admit our anger, and then secondly, I would instruct us today that we need to delay our response. Delay our response. And I go back to our passage there in Nehemiah 5, where I quoted verse 6, where Nehemiah admitted that he was very angry. And in verse 7, having admitted he was angry, Nehemiah then says, and I pondered them. And he's talking about the charges, the complaints, the criticisms, the reality of the situation. He said, I pondered them in my mind. You see, what he is saying there, that he was giving himself time to deliberately examine, to carefully contemplate, to accurately understand what was happening. It was not a flying off of the handle kind of response. So we need to delay our response. Be sure we understand clearly and accurately the situation at hand. When anger rises within us, we need to gain control of our thoughts and of our emotions. And then we need to examine them before we express them. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11 says, a fool always loses his temper, but a wise man holds it back. So we need to admit that we're angry. We need to delay our response so that we can clearly and accurately understand the situation at hand. And ultimately, we need to resolve our anger, to resolve it. You see, if we refuse to address the anger, it eventually creates bitterness, and then Satan is going to take that opportunity to create discouragement and defeat in our lives. And one very important ingredient in resolving anger is healthy communication. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31, we find these words, let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. I like the way the contemporary English version translates that verse, and it says, stop being bitter and angry and mad at others. Don't yell at one another or curse each other or ever be rude. Well, I want to close our devotion today with two actions that you can take in order to be angry and sin not, as God's word instructs us. One of those actions is this. You need to avoid or be very careful around angry people. And there's a lot of them, aren't there? Proverbs 14, the first part of verse 16 says this, a wise man is cautious and turns away from evil. Anger is contagious. If we spend time with angry people, we're going to become angry people. Proverbs 22, verses 24 and 25 says this, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. So be careful. Avoid angry people. And the second action that I would suggest today is this. Lead a balanced life. A balanced life. You see, when our priorities are rightly chosen and established, we're less likely to be filled with anger. Stress and constant hurry creates an opportunity for frustration and anger. And so you see, when our schedules are overcrowded and our lives are overwhelmed, it's much easier to respond in anger. You've discovered that, haven't you? Boy, I know I have, for sure. Of course, we need to manage anger for our own good, but there's another reason why we need to manage anger, and I see it in this illustration. The story is told of a pastor who was putting a wooden fence around his backyard, and he's hammering away and doing the work that's necessary, and he noticed that a little boy had come along and was watching him work. Now, the boy didn't say a word, he just watched. The preacher kept working, thinking that the little boy would leave, but he didn't. He didn't leave. And so, pleased at the thought that his work was being admired, the pastor finally said, "Well, son, are you trying to pick up some pointers on building?" The young boy answered, "No, I'm just waiting to hear what a preacher says when he hits his thumb with a hammer." See, we need to control our anger because other people are watching us. We are a witness to the Prince of Peace. We need to live as such. We noted on Monday, God's Word calls for disciples of Jesus to be peacemakers, and managing anger is a critical step in helping us to achieve that goal of peacemaking. So when we come back on Friday, you are coming back, aren't you? When we come back again on Friday, I'm going to be sharing with us about how God is at work in our life, enabling us to pursue peace as we strive to be peacemakers. Until then, be safe, stay healthy, trust in God, pursue peace.